She walked into that studio like she owned the world. And why wouldn't she? She was Zara Osei, stunning, black, and brilliant. A natural crown of hair, a white linen dress, gold at her ears, the kind of woman the camera doesn't find. She finds it. This was supposed to be the biggest day of her career, the campaign that would change everything. She sat down in that makeup chair ready, and then the artist looked at her. Slowly, coldly, up and down, and said, "I don't work with that skin type." Just like that. In front of everyone. Two assistants who suddenly found the floor very interesting. A photographer who forgot how to speak. A room full of people who chose silence over decency. Zara felt that familiar heat rise in her throat, the one she had been swallowing since she was 16 years old. She opened her mouth to respond. But before she could say a single word, a voice came from the back of the room. Low, quiet, like the warning before an earthquake. One word. Continue. He was standing in the shadows. A Korean man in a black suit. A dragon tattoo climbing the left side of his neck. Eyes so dark and so still, they looked like the moment before a verdict is delivered. Nobody knew who he was yet. Nobody knew what he was about to do. Nobody knew that within 48 hours, that makeup artist would be holding a broom in the same building she once ruled, and that the black woman she had humiliated in front of witnesses would become the face seen by millions across 4 continents. Nobody saw it coming, but it was already in motion. Before starting the story, comment down below where you are watching from and what time it is there. If stories of karma, love, and hidden truths move you, leave a like, be sure to subscribe to the channel, and click join to become a member and help our channel. The studio smelled like privilege. That was the first thing Zara Osei noticed when she stepped through the glass doors of Aura Agency on a Tuesday morning that felt, in every possible way, like the beginning of something she had been working toward her entire life. The air carried the particular scent of expensive product and artificial cold, the kind of cold that only exists in spaces designed to make ordinary people feel slightly uncomfortable, slightly underdressed, slightly less than. Zara was none of those things, and she knew it, but she had learned long ago that knowing something and feeling it in the marrow of your bones were 2 entirely different matters. She was 28 years old, and she walked like someone who had earned every inch of the floor beneath her feet. Her white linen dress moved with her, the way expensive fabric moves, not clinging, not floating, but simply agreeing with her body as though it had no other choice. Her hair was natural, a full twist-out crown that she had spent the early hours of the morning perfecting. Not because she needed it to be perfect, but because this day was the kind of day you prepared for like a ceremony. Gold sandals, a small caramel leather bag with gold hardware that caught the studio light every time she shifted her weight. Gold hoops at her ears. Nothing else. The neck was the adornment. The skin was the adornment. She had understood that about herself for years, even when the industry had not. The campaign was called Meridian. It was the kind of campaign that came once in a career, a full, international rollout for a luxury lifestyle brand, expanding into 4 new markets simultaneously. Seoul, London, Snow, Paulo, Lagos. The brief was ambitious, the budget was considerable, and the creative director had specifically requested her, not someone who looked like her. Zara Osei by name, by portfolio, by the particular quality of stillness she brought to a frame that made every photographer who had ever worked with her say the same thing. The camera does not find her, she finds it. She had received the contract 3 weeks prior and had read it 4 times. She had signed it on a Monday night, sitting at her kitchen counter with a glass of water beside her. No wine, because she wanted to be entirely clear-headed when she put her name to something this significant. She had taken a photograph of the signed page and sent it to her mother in Accra, with no caption. Her mother had responded with a single line, "I always knew." What Zara did not know, could not have known, as she approached the reception desk of Aura Agency that Tuesday morning, was that the thing about to happen to her would matter in ways that extended far beyond her. She did not know that the moment she was about to step into had been quietly accumulating for years in the industry around her. Like water rising behind a wall that everyone had agreed to pretend was not there. She did not know that 23 other women across 8 countries had experienced some version of what was about to happen to her in the studios and dressing rooms of this industry, and that not one of them had said a word publicly. Because saying a word publicly meant becoming the story instead of the work. She did not know any of this. She walked toward the makeup department with her appointment confirmation on her phone screen, and she smiled at the receptionist. And the receptionist smiled back, and everything was still possible. Celine Moreau was standing at her station when Zara entered the makeup room. The room was large and white and lined with mirrors edged in globe bulbs. The kind that made every face look slightly theatrical, slightly exposed. There were 2 other artists in the room, both younger, both mid-task, both aware in the way that junior staff are always aware of the presence of a senior colleague. Attuned to her moods, the way sailors attune themselves to the behavior of wind. Celine was 44 inches of composure, wrapped in a black apron over white silk. Blonde hair pulled back in a low knot, blue eyes that had spent 15 years looking at faces with the particular clinical precision of someone who had turned aesthetic judgment into a form of authority. She was good at her job, not extraordinary. That distinction was important, though no one in her immediate circle had been honest enough with her to make it. But she was good, and she had built her reputation carefully. And she wore that reputation the way some people wear armor, not for protection exactly, but because they had forgotten what they looked like without it. She turned when Zara entered. The scan was brief. It was the kind of assessment that happens in fractions of seconds below the threshold of what most people would call a decision, though it was absolutely a decision. It moved from Zara's face to her neck to her hands. Taking in the depth and richness of her skin, the particular dark luminosity of it, the way it held light differently than the faces. Celine spent most of her professional life working with, and something in Celine's expression settled into a flatness that was not neutral. It was the flatness of a conclusion already reached. I don't work with that skin type. She said it the way someone might say they didn't stock a particular product, matter of fact, unbothered. She had turned back to her station before the final syllable had finished moving through the air. Zara stood very still. The 2 junior artists did not look up. The smaller of the 2, a young Korean woman barely out of her training program, had gone slightly rigid, her brush suspended above a palette. Her eyes fixed somewhere on the middle distance with the focused determination of someone pretending very hard to be somewhere else. The other, a man in his late 20s, had found something deeply interesting about the texture of the counter in front of him. The room was very quiet, except for the low hum of the building's ventilation and the distant sound of a shutter test from the studio 2 doors down. Zara felt the heat first. It started at the base of her throat, that specific, well-documented heat that the body produces in moments of public humiliation, the biological cousin of shame, though it is not shame. It has been mistaken for shame for generations. It is not shame. It is the recognition that something wrong is happening, and that the room has collectively decided to let it happen, and that the woman at the center of it must now decide. In real time, in front of witnesses, whether she is going to absorb it quietly or do something else entirely. Knowing that doing something else entirely will cost her something, will always cost her something, will somehow become the event that people remember instead of the thing that caused it. She had been here before, not in this studio, not with this woman, but she had been here before. She had been here at 16 in a casting call in London, where the director had said they were going for a specific look while looking directly at her. And she had understood and smiled and left. She had been here at 22 at a show in Milan where the makeup team had worked with her skin reluctantly and incorrectly, and she had gone on the runway with foundation 3 shades to light because she had been afraid to say anything. She had been here at 25 in New York when a photographer had told her she was striking but difficult to light, and she had thanked him, as if difficulty was her fault rather than his equipment and imagination. She had been collecting these moments for a decade. She had never said that out loud to anyone except her mother and one close friend who had told her that things were changing. Things were getting better. The industry was learning. Give it time. She had given it time. She was still giving it time at 28. Standing in a makeup room in Seoul, in the silence left behind by a woman who had just told her, in front of witnesses, that her skin was a problem she did not intend to engage with, Zara opened her mouth, which she would have said she would wonder about for a long time afterward. She had scenarios in her head. She had been building them for years. The way people who have been treated badly in the same way repeatedly begin to rehearse responses in quiet moments. In showers, on trains, as a form of preparation that feels productive even when it never quite prepares you for the actual event. She had words ready. They were composed words, careful words, the kind that could be recounted later without making her the difficult one. Without giving anyone the ammunition of she overreacted, words that named what had happened without becoming a scene. She never said them, because before she could, a voice came from the back of the room. Low, quiet, absolutely certain of its own weight. Continue. It was not directed at her. It was not directed at Celine. It was directed at no one, and at the room itself, the way a single spoken word can reorient the atmosphere of a space without announcing its intention to do so. Zara turned toward the source. The man was standing near the far wall, beside the door that led to the executive corridor, in a posture that suggested he had been there for some time without anyone noticing, arms crossed. One shoulder against the wall, completely still in the way that some people are completely still, and it does not read as passivity but as the precise opposite of it. He was in a black suit, white shirt, open at the collar. A tattoo climbed the left side of his neck, a dragon in dark ink, detailed and deliberate, its uppermost edge reaching toward his jaw. His eyes were very dark, and they were on Celine with an expression that contained no anger whatsoever, which was somehow the most unnerving thing about it. Celine had turned, she had seen him. Something moved through her face that she controlled almost immediately, but not quite immediately enough. He pushed off the wall and left the room without another word. The door closed, the ventilation hummed. Zara looked at the closed door for a moment, then she looked at the junior artist who had been pretending to be elsewhere, who was now looking at the floor with what appeared to be the concentrated effort of someone trying not to cry. Then she looked at Celine, who had resumed her position at the station as though nothing had occurred, though her movements now had a quality of deliberateness that had not been there before. The quality of someone performing normalcy for an audience they cannot see. Little did Celine know that in that fraction of a second, when the dragon on his neck had appeared in the doorframe, the countdown to everything she had built had begun. Little did she know that the man's silence was more dangerous than any word. Little did she know that the man who had just left that hallway hadn't left to forget what he had seen. He had left to act. Zara picked up her caramel-colored bag from the hook on the wall. She looked in the mirror one last time, her own reflection, at her own skin, at the very face that someone had just called a problem. And then she turned her back to Celine's counter and left through the same door she had entered, with the same posture, with the same step, as if what had happened in that room had no power to bend who she was. Outside in the corridor, the building hummed around her with its artificial cold and its expensive scent. And she stood for a moment with her hand on the wall, breathing, and somewhere 2 floors above her, a man in a black suit was already making a phone call that would change everything. She did not know that yet, but she would. The phone call lasted 3 minutes and 14 seconds. Chen Hukjin knew this because he had developed over years of operating in spaces where information was the only currency that never depreciated, the habit of tracking duration. Not obsessively, he was not a man who kept records of small things. But he had learned that the length of a conversation was often its most honest data point. Long calls meant negotiation. Short calls meant decisions already made. 3 minutes and 14 seconds meant that what he wanted was possible. That the person on the other end of the line understood the urgency without requiring explanation, and that by the time he stepped back into the elevator and pressed the button for the executive floor, the mechanism had already been set in motion. He did not think about Zara Osei in the elevator. He thought about numbers. He thought about the current valuation of Aura Agency, which he had reviewed as background material before the morning's meeting and which he now found himself reassessing not as an abstract figure, but as a concrete transaction. He thought about the agency's ownership structure, a partnership of three, two of whom he knew personally, one of whom owed him a favor that had been sitting uncollected for 2 years. He thought about timeline. He thought about what his legal team would need and how quickly they could move if he made clear that speed was the priority. He did not think about why he was doing this in terms that involved feeling. He was not, by practice or by temperament, a man who examined his motivations in real time. He made decisions and he executed them, and occasionally, much later, in the particular quiet of 4 in the morning, when the city outside his window had gone to its lowest volume, he would understand something about himself that he had not understood at the moment of action. This was how he had always operated. This was how he had survived. What he did not examine, standing in that elevator with his phone in his hand and the transaction already beginning to move through the channels he had activated, was the image that had fixed itself behind his eyes the moment he had heard those words come out of Celine Moreau's mouth. Not Zara's face, though he had seen her face, had seen the precise, controlled stillness that moved across it like weather, across a landscape. The effort of containment that was visible only if you knew what contained pain looked like. And he knew he had seen it before. He had seen it on a face much younger and much closer to him than the face of a stranger in a makeup room. What had fixed itself was the room itself. The two assistants looking away, the hum of the ventilation filling the space where a human response should have been. The collective agreement of everyone present to become temporarily blind and deaf and absent, to subtract themselves from a moment that required witness, because witnessing was expensive and silence was free. He had been in that room once before, not that room, a different one, in a different city, 10 years earlier. When he had been 26 and his sister had been 19, and the world had been teaching her, with patient cruelty, that certain spaces were not designed with her in mind. He had not been there for that particular lesson. He had heard about it afterward, third hand. The way family members hear about the worst things filtered through other people's discomfort. Stripped of its specific texture, rendered into a summary that did not and could not carry the full weight of what it had cost her. He had listened to that summary and had felt something harden in his chest that had never entirely softened since. Not guilt, exactly. Guilt implied that he could have done something and had chosen not to. He had not known. He had not been there. The hardness was something else, something closer to the sensation of a debt that cannot be repaid, because the moment it was incurred has already passed into the irrecoverable past. This morning, for the first time in 10 years, he had been there. And so the phone call had lasted 3 minutes and 14 seconds. And by the time he sat down in the meeting room on the executive floor and exchanged pleasantries with 2 men who did not yet know they were about to sell their company, the mechanism was already turning. He did not mention it during the meeting. The meeting was about a different matter entirely, a licensing agreement, a content distribution arrangement, the kind of transactional conversation that occupied most of his professional hours, and that he navigated with the automatic fluency of someone who had been doing this since he was young enough that the older men in the room had underestimated him. He was good at being underestimated. He had built several important advantages out of it. The dragon on his neck made people look twice and then look away, which meant they were never quite looking at his eyes, and his eyes were where the real negotiation happened. The meeting concluded. Hands were shaken. The 2 partners walked him to the elevator with the slightly flushed cordiality of men who believed they had performed well. He smiled at them with the portion of himself that was always available for smiling, and said nothing that was untrue and nothing that was complete. 48 hours, that was the timeline his legal team confirmed before noon. 48 hours and the transfer of ownership would be, for all practical purposes, complete, pending the final signatures that would come within the week. But the essential architecture of the thing would be finished. He had moved faster, for less important reasons. Zara did not go back to her apartment immediately. She walked for a while instead, through the streets outside the agency. In the particular direction of nowhere that a person walks when they need the rhythm of movement to do the work that thought cannot do alone, the city was doing what cities do in the middle of a working day, flowing around her with its noise, and its business and its complete indifference to what had just happened to her, and she walked inside that indifference and was, in a strange way, grateful for it. Public grief requires an audience. She did not want an audience. She called her mother from a bench in a small park 3 blocks from the agency. It was early morning in Accra. Her mother was always awake before the sun, and the call connected on the second ring. She did not recount the full scene. She said, "Something happened today." She said, "I'm all right." She said, "I just needed to hear your voice." Her mother, who had raised her with the particular combination of tenderness and iron that produces women who endure without being diminished by endurance, said, "You know who you are, Zara. Nothing that happens in a room changes what you carry in. Remember that." She stayed on the bench for a while after the call ended. The sun was doing something generous with the light, and the trees were very green, and a child somewhere nearby was laughing at something with the total body commitment that children bring to laughter before they learn to do it more carefully. She watched the light in the trees, and she breathed, and she reminded herself that she had signed a contract, that the campaign still existed, that she had not been removed from anything except one makeup room, and that makeup rooms were not the point. What she did not know was that at that precise moment, across the city, her name was being written into a document of a very different kind. The internal memo went out at 9 in the morning 2 days later. It was brief and formatted, with the clean impersonality of all corporate communications that carry significant weight. The ones that are deliberately stripped of emotional register precisely because their content is emotional enough. It stated that Aura Agency had been acquired by the Chen Group effective immediately. It stated that new leadership would be announced within the week. It stated that all existing contracts with clients and talent would be honored and in most cases, expanded. And it stated, in a single sentence near the bottom, that several people would later identify as the most carefully worded line in the document, that a comprehensive review of professional conduct standards across all departments would begin the following Monday. Celine read the memo, standing at her station. She read it twice. She set her phone face down on the counter and picked up a brush and put it down again. The junior artist she worked with most frequently came in at 9:15 and found her staring at the mirror with the expression of someone trying to locate something they are not sure they have lost yet. "Did you see the memo?" the junior artist asked. "Yes," Celine said. "Do you know who the Chen Group is?" A pause. "I've heard the name." What Celine did not say, what she could not say because she had not yet assembled the pieces into a shape she was willing to look at directly, was that she had recognized Huckchin the moment she saw him in the doorway of the makeup room 2 days prior. Not personally, but the way you recognize the species of a thing even when you have not seen this specific specimen before. She had seen men like him in the corridors of this industry her entire career, men who occupied space differently than other men, for whom the usual calibrations of social deference did not seem to apply. Men around whom the air had a quality of heightened attention that no one acknowledged out loud, but everyone felt. She had processed his presence the way she processed most presences that made her vaguely uncomfortable. She had looked away. She understood now that looking away had not made her invisible to him. At 11:30 that morning, a woman from Human Resources appeared at the door of the makeup room with an envelope. The envelope contained a single sheet of paper. Celine read it standing up. which she would think about later, the specific dignity of remaining standing while reading something that was designed to bring you low. The language was professional and unambiguous. Her position had been eliminated as part of a restructuring of the Creative Services Department. Effective Friday, return of company materials expected by end of business. And then, handwritten at the bottom of the page in the clean, minimal script of someone who had thought carefully about every letter. Mr. Chen would like you to be informed personally that your first departure task is the third-floor corridor. The brush she had been holding fell from her hand. It made a small sound on the floor, lighter than you would expect, almost gentle, the sound of something released rather than dropped. He destroyed me, she whispered, in a language that wasn't her own, but was the only one that came to her at that moment. He destroyed me without saying a single word. The junior artist across the room said nothing. But she did not look away. Zara received a phone call that same afternoon from a number she did not recognize. She almost did not answer. She answered. The voice on the other end introduced itself as the new creative director of Aura Agency. Appointed effective that morning, and it said her name with the specific emphasis of someone who has been told that this name is important, that this name is the reason they are making this call. We'd like you to come back, he said. Not just for the original shoot. We'd like you to be the face of the entire Meridian campaign. All for markets. Full brand ambassadorship. We'll send the revised contract today. Zara was standing in her kitchen when she received this call. She was barefoot on the cold tile. Outside her window, the city was doing its afternoon thing, layered and continuous and indifferent. She held the phone and she did not speak for a moment that was slightly longer than comfortable. Who made this decision? She asked. The new ownership, the creative director said. Mr. Chen specifically requested that we reach out to you today. She stood there in her kitchen, with the tile cold under her feet and the city outside and the revised contract on its way to her inbox, and she felt something move through her that was not quite gratitude, and not quite understanding, and not quite the feeling of a circle closing. It was something more unresolved than any of those things. It was the feeling of a question forming that she did not yet know how to ask. She accepted. She went back to the studio the following morning, and this time when she walked through the glass doors, the air inside still smelled like expensive product and artificial cold. But something in its architecture had shifted in a way she could feel without being able to name. The makeup room was different now too. A new artist was at the station, warm-eyed, prepared, with a kit that Zara noticed immediately contained foundations in a genuine range of depths. The kind of range that only exists in a kit when the person who assembled it was thinking about the actual breadth of human skin rather than a narrow portion of it. And on the table beside the kit, there was a small box. The new artist looked at it. It arrived this morning, she said. Sent up from the executive floor. No note. Zara opened it. Inside, nestled in tissue paper, was a pigment palette unlike anything she had seen assembled in a Seoul studio. Deep ochres, rich umbers, volcanic blacks with warm undertones. The kind of formulations that are made by people who have spent time understanding the particular luminosity of dark skin rather than treating it as a variation of something else. The brand printed on the inside lid was Nigerian. Small batch, the kind of thing you find if you are specifically looking for it. Zara held the palette and looked at it for a long time. Who sent it? The artist asked. Zara closed the box carefully. Someone who was paying attention, she said. What she did not say, what she was only beginning to understand, was that the man who had sent it had been paying a very particular kind of attention. Not the attention of someone performing concern. The attention of someone who had been carrying something heavy for a long time and had recognized, in a makeup room in Seoul on a Tuesday morning, the weight of something familiar. She did not know his full story yet, but she was beginning to know that there was one. The corridors of the newly renamed agency felt different in the days that followed. Not visibly different. The walls were the same white, the lighting was the same calibrated cool. The sound of cameras and direction calls still moved through the building with its familiar rhythm. But something had shifted in the atmosphere, the way pressure shifts before weather, perceptible to those who had learned to read the signs, and invisible to those who had not. The staff who remained spoke more carefully. The ones who had witnessed the makeup room incident said nothing about it publicly. But they thought about it privately, in the specific way that people think about a moment they almost intervened in and did not, the retrospective accounting, that has no resolution because the moment has already passed and the only ledger it exists in is the internal one. Zara arrived at the studio each morning that week with the particular focus of someone who has decided to let the work be the answer to everything. It was a discipline she had developed early, the understanding that excellence, in her industry and in her specific position within it, was not just an aspiration but a form of argument. Every frame she gave the photographer was a sentence in a case she had been building her entire career. She did not think of it in those terms consciously. It was simply the way she worked, the total commitment she brought to the space in front of the lens. The quality of presence that made the creative director say, at the end of the second day of shooting, that she was the most instinctive subject he had worked with in 11 years. She did not see Hyukjin on the first day, nor on the second. On the third day, she turned a corner in the executive corridor on her way to a contract review meeting and walked directly into the fact of him. He was coming from the opposite direction, phone in hand, moving with the unhurried purposefulness of someone for whom interruption to forward momentum is simply not a category that applies. He looked up when she appeared. They both stopped. The corridor was narrow enough that passing without acknowledgement would have required a deliberate and slightly absurd negotiation of space. And neither of them was the kind of person who performed that kind of social pretense convincingly. Zara Osei, he said. It was not a greeting exactly. It was the way you say a name when you have been thinking it and the person it belongs to has appeared. And saying it is a way of resolving the small internal dissonance of that coincidence. Chen Hyukjin, she replied. A pause. The ventilation moved air through the corridor. Somewhere behind a closed door, a phone rang twice and stopped. You were there that day, she said. It was not a question. I was. Why? He looked at the window at the end of the corridor for a moment, the city visible through it, gray and layered and continuous. A business meeting, he said. She held his gaze. She had spent enough time in front of cameras to know the difference between a face performing neutrality and a face that had simply decided not to offer more than it had been asked for. His face was the second kind. There was a precision to his stillness that suggested not absence of interior life, but a long practice of keeping interior life where it belonged. That's not the whole answer, she said. No, he agreed. It's not. He did not offer the rest, and she, who had been taught by a decade of professional navigation to measure the cost of every push, decided in that moment that the corridor was not the place and this was not the time, and she nodded once and continued past him toward her meeting. She felt his gaze on her back for exactly the duration it took to reach the corner. She did not turn around. But her hand, holding the contract folder, had tightened its grip by the time she rounded the door. The Meridian campaign shoot consumed the following days with the totalizing intensity that only the best creative work produces. The kind of process that makes the hours disappear, not because they are easy, but because everything outside the frame becomes temporarily irrelevant. Zara moved through it with a fluency that surprised even her, as though something had been freed in her by the events of the preceding week. Some internal permission granted that she had not known she was waiting for. The photographs that came out of those sessions would later be described by the brand's global creative director as the finest editorial work the campaign had produced across all 4 markets. At the time, on set, the team simply felt that something true was happening in front of them and tried not to disrupt it. Hyukjin appeared on the 4th day of shooting. He came without announcement. He was the owner of the building and he required no appointment within it. and he stood at the back of the studio in a posture that had become Zara was beginning to understand. His characteristic one, slightly removed from the center of activity, entirely present, watching with the focused non-intrusiveness of someone who has learned that the best information comes to those who create the conditions for forgetting they are in the room. The photographer noticed him and nodded. The creative director nodded. The team adjusted around his presence, the way water adjusts around a stone, not dramatically, simply finding the new configuration and continuing. Zara noticed him between setups. She was having her hair adjusted, her back to the studio, watching him in the mirror. He was looking at the monitor displaying the test frames from the morning's work. His expression, viewing the images, had something in it she had not seen before. Not the boardroom neutrality, and not the corridor precision, but something quieter, something that moved across his face briefly and was gone before she could fully read it. She decided, in that moment, to do something she almost never did in professional settings. She walked over to him. He looked up when she approached. Neither of them spoke for a moment. They both looked at the monitor, at the images on it, at her face in those images, at the particular quality the camera had found in her that morning. "They're good," she said finally. "Yes," he said. "They are. You didn't have to come today. No, but you did." He turned from the monitor and looked at her with the full weight of his attention, which was, she was discovering, a significant thing to be the recipient of. The dragon on his neck was fully visible in the studio light. The ink detailed, an ancient-looking climbing toward his jaw, with the patient determination of something that had decided where it was going a long time ago. "I wanted to see how it came out," he said. It was a simple sentence. It was also not simple at all. She understood this, and he knew that she understood it, and they remained in that understanding for a moment. That was slightly longer than professional and slightly shorter than anything else. A duration that had its own particular charge. The way certain silences between people carry more information than the conversations that precede and follow them. "The palette," she said. "The one that arrived without a note." He said nothing. "It was from Nigeria," she said. "A small brand. You'd have to know specifically what you were looking for to find it." "Someone on my team sourced it," he said. "Someone on your team," she repeated. The corner of his mouth moved. It was the smallest possible movement. It was the closest she had seen him come to something that was not composed. She looked at him for a moment longer. Then she returned to the set. That evening, she sat in her apartment with the city outside, doing its nighttime reconfiguration, the shift of light and sound that happens when the commercial day ends and the personal one begins. And she thought about what she knew and what she did not know about Chen Hu-jin. She knew the public version. Anyone with access to a search engine and an hour knew the public version, the Chen Group, the conglomerate, the expansion into entertainment and media. The name that appeared at the intersections of several industries in the kind of proximity that suggested either excellent instincts or information advantages that went beyond the conventional. She knew the visible markers, the suit, the watch, the particular quality of authority that is not performed because it does not need to be. She knew the tattoo, which was the only thing about him that made legible a history not contained in any board filing. What she did not know was the sister. She did not know the 19-year-old girl in a room in a different city 10 years ago, or what had happened to her there, or what it had cost her. Or what it had cost him to learn about it secondhand and be unable to do anything about it. She did not know the specific weight of that particular debt, the one that is incurred not by action but by absence. The one that has no settlement because the terms of repayment can never be exactly matched to the original injury. She would learn these things. But not yet. What she felt, sitting in her apartment that night, with the city outside and the unsigned revised contract on her kitchen counter, was the specific unease of realizing that someone she had initially categorized as context, as background, as mechanism, as the explanation for why her circumstances had changed, was not context at all. Was, in fact, a person with interior dimensions she had not accounted for, dimensions that were becoming increasingly difficult to not account for, dimensions that she was finding herself curious about in ways that had nothing to do with professional calculation. This was inconvenient. She recognized it as inconvenient because she had learned to recognize the early signs of this particular inconvenience. The way certain feelings announce themselves before they arrive in full, the heightened attention, the retrospective replaying of small exchanges, the noticing of details that have no professional relevance. She had felt it before, it had cost her before, in ways she had recovered from with more difficulty than she would admit to most people. She was not sure she was ready for the cost of it again. She was also not entirely sure. Sitting in the dark of her apartment at 11 in the evening, with the city pressing its light against her windows, that readiness was going to be relevant. The journalist appeared on a Friday. His name was Park Jin-ho, and he worked for a digital publication that occupied the specific media territory where cultural criticism and entertainment reporting overlap, the kind of outlet that is read by everyone in the industry and cited by no one publicly, because citing it means admitting you read it, and reading it means admitting you follow the things it covers. And following the things it covers requires a degree of honesty about the industry's interior that most of its participants preferred to keep interior properly. He had heard about the makeup room, he had heard about the acquisition, he had done the arithmetic, and he had a source, or something close to a source. Which in this kind of journalism meant a person willing to speak with the specific motivated energy of someone who has recently lost something and is reassembling the narrative of events in a way that centers their own grievance. The source was Celine Moreau. She had given the interview from her apartment, sitting across from Park Jin-ho with the composed bitterness of someone who has had several days to construct their account of events and has chosen, during that construction, to omit the load-bearing elements. She spoke about professionalism. She spoke about her record. She spoke about sudden termination and the vulnerability of creative workers in a consolidating industry. She used the phrase power harassment twice and unjust 4 times, and she described herself, in the final minutes of the conversation, as someone who had been made an example of for a decision that had been, she maintained, a matter of professional judgment. She did not say what the professional judgment had been. Park Jin-ho published the piece on a Friday afternoon, which is when you publish things you want to travel over the weekend, when editorial oversight is reduced and social attention is high. The headline was carefully calibrated, sympathetic to Celine without being specific enough to be directly challenged, vague enough to invite interpretation, specific enough to point clearly in one direction. By Friday evening, it had moved through the industry networks with the particular velocity of a story that confirmed something people already half believed. By Saturday morning, something else had begun to happen. The first response came from a model named SEO Yuna, who posted 3 paragraphs on her personal platform about an experience she had had 2 years prior in a European studio. In a makeup room, with a woman she described in careful terms that were nevertheless identifiable to anyone who had worked in the same circles. The second came from a Nigerian British photographer's assistant who had been on set for a campaign 3 years ago and described, with meticulous precision, an incident she had never reported because she had been new and had needed the work and had not believed that naming the thing would change the thing. By Sunday, there were 4 more. The narrative had not simply turned. It had reversed with the force of something that had been held under pressure for a long time. And the release of it was not dramatic. There was no single explosive moment, no confrontation, no public scene. It was simply account after account after account, each one arriving with the quiet weight of truth that has been waiting for company before it is willing to speak. Celine read them from her apartment. She read them all. I destroyed you, she said to the screen, but this time the I was herself. And the you was everything she had built, and the destruction hadn't come from the outside. It had come from within, accumulated over years, waiting only for the first window of opportunity. Outside her window, the city continued. It did not adjust for her. It never had. Zara heard about the article on Saturday morning. She heard about the responses by Saturday afternoon. By Sunday, she had received 47 messages from people in the industry, colleagues, photographers, brands, strangers, and she had read them all and responded to none of them, because she understood that responding was a form of performing. And what she felt about this moment was not something she wanted to perform. What she felt was complicated. She felt the particular exhaustion of being the center of a conversation about yourself that you did not choose and cannot control. She felt something that was adjacent to vindication, but was not exactly vindication, because vindication implies that the wrong thing needed external confirmation to be real, and it had been real in her body since the moment it happened. She felt grateful for the women who had spoken. She felt angry that it had required a Friday afternoon think piece about a white woman's feelings to create the conditions in which those women felt safe speaking. She felt all of these things simultaneously, and they did not resolve into a single clean emotion, and she sat with their irresolution the way she had learned over years to sit with things that do not simplify. She was sitting with them on Sunday evening when someone knocked at her door. She was not expecting anyone. She opened it. Hyuk-jin was standing in the corridor outside her apartment with his jacket open and his hands in his pockets, which was the most unguarded she had seen him, physically. The subtle adjustment of a person who has arrived somewhere, having debated whether to arrive, and is still slightly in the debate. The dragon on his neck was lit by the corridor light. He looked, for the first time since she had known him, like someone who had decided to do something without knowing exactly how it would go. I saw the articles, he said. Everyone saw the articles, she said. I wanted to, he stopped. He looked at the floor briefly, which was something she had not seen him do before. The fractional dropping of the gaze that is not defeat but is its immediate neighbor. I wanted to make sure you were all right. She looked at him for a moment. At the careful suit and the tattoo and the hands in the pockets and the specific quality of this version of him, less composed, more present, more legible in the way that people become legible when they have decided that being understood matters more than being in control of how. Come in, she said. He came in. She made tea because it was something to do with her hands, and because the ritual of it, the water, the heat, the waiting, created a structure for the first minutes of his being there that neither of them had to negotiate. Her apartment was not large, but it was particular. Books stacked in a way that suggested use rather than display. A small collection of photographs on one wall that were personal rather than decorative. The palette he had sent still on the kitchen counter where she had placed it the day it arrived and had not moved since. Whether consciously or not, she had not examined. He sat at the kitchen table without being directed to it, which told her something, that he was a man who, in unfamiliar spaces, found the most structurally honest place to be and occupied it without ceremony. She noted this the way she had been noting things about him since the corridor, adding it to the accumulating inventory of details that were assembling themselves without her full permission into a portrait. She set the tea in front of him and sat across the table, and they were quiet for a moment in a way that was not uncomfortable. The specific quiet of two people who have both spent a great deal of their lives managing their own silences and recognize in each other that capacity. Your sister, she said. He looked up. You mentioned her, she said, in the corridor. You said it wasn't the whole answer. He wrapped both hands around the mug. The gesture was so ordinary, so human, so removed from every version of him she had encountered in professional contexts, that it did something to the interior distance she had been maintaining with careful deliberation. Her name is Ga, he said. She was 19. She had been trying to break into the fashion industry here, not modeling, the business side. She wanted to work in creative direction. He paused. He was looking at the mug. There was a senior woman at a major agency who made it very clear to her, in front of other people, that her aesthetic sensibility was not the right fit. Those were the words used. Not the right fit. Another pause. GA understood what was meant. Everyone in the room understood what was meant. No one said anything. Were you there? No. The word had a weight to it that had nothing to do with its syllable count. I was in Busan, a meeting I considered important at the time. I heard about it a week later from a mutual friend, not from Gadia didn't tell me because she knew what I would do and she didn't want me to do it. What would you have done? He looked up at her then, and she saw it, the thing behind the composure, the specific quality of what had been sitting behind everything since the elevator, since the phone call, since the 3 minutes and 14 seconds. It was not anger. It was older than anger. It was the thing that remains after anger has finished burning, and what is left is simply the shape of the absence. Something I could not undo, he said. She held his gaze. But this time, you did something you could undo. This time I did something that was possible to do correctly. Zara looked at him for a long moment. Outside, the city performed its Sunday night wind down. The particular acoustic texture of a city releasing the tension of the week, the sound of things returning to their slower rhythms. She thought about Gia, 19 years old, in a room in front of witnesses who had chosen blindness. She thought about herself, at 19, at 22, at 25. She thought about the different shapes the same injury takes in different rooms, in different cities, in different decades, and how it finds the same fundamental place in the body every time regardless of the variation in its delivery. She's all right now, Zara asked. Something shifted in his expression. Not quite a smile, more the precursor to one. The internal movement that a smile comes from before it reaches the surface. She runs a creative consultancy in Jeju. She has 12 employees. She is considerably more successful than the woman who told her she wasn't the right fit. Good, Zara said. Yes, he said. Good. They drank their tea. The city moved outside. The pallet sat on the counter between them without either of them mentioning it. Present, the way significant objects are present when two people are in the same room as them, not ignored. Simply held in peripheral awareness, understood to be part of the conversation without being spoken of directly. It was Hukjin who spoke first. After the silence had stretched into a duration that had moved past comfortable and into the territory of something else, the territory where silence between two people stops being the absence of speech and starts being a form of it. The campaign photographs, he said. I saw the full set yesterday, and they are. He stopped. He seemed, unusually, to be searching for precision rather than choosing the first adequate word. They are the best work I have seen come out of this building, possibly the best I have seen come out of this industry in some time. They are. Another pause, and this time she understood that the pause was not about finding a word, but about deciding whether to say what he actually wanted to say, which was a different kind of search entirely. They are true, he said finally. They look true. Most fashion work looks like a proposition. These look like a fact. She was quiet for a moment. She had received many professional compliments in her career, some earned, some performative, some deployed with the specific strategic intent that compliments are sometimes deployed with in industries where approval is currency. She had developed an accurate sensor for the difference. What he had just said registered as none of those things. It registered as an observation. A person reporting what they had seen without the intervening layer of what they wanted her to do with the information. Thank you, she said, and meant it simply. He nodded. He looked at the palette on the counter. She watched him look at it. He looked at her. I wasn't performing a gesture, he said, with the palette. I want to be clear about that. I know, she said. I'm not, he set the mug down. He seemed, briefly, to be a person doing the internal equivalent of finding his footing on uneven ground. I'm not accustomed to explaining myself, I've noticed. This is more difficult than buying a company. She looked at him. The directness of it, the simple, undefended admission, landed in her chest with a precision that she had not anticipated, and that the careful distance she had been maintaining had not prepared her for. She felt it the way you feel the moment a season changes, not dramatically. Not with announcement, but with the particular sensory certainty of something that has shifted into a new configuration and will not shift back. Hyuk-jin, she said. His given name, for the first time she saw him register it. The almost imperceptible change in his posture, the fractional opening of the expression. Yes, why are you here, not the articles. The real reason. He looked at her across the kitchen table with the full weight of the attention she had been receiving from him. In fragments and at professional distances for the past 2 weeks, and this time there was no corridor, no studio, no transactional frame to contain it. It arrived with the entirety of itself. Because I have found, for the past 14 days, he said. With the slow deliberateness of someone constructing a sentence that must be accurate, that I am considerably more aware of where you are than is professionally explicable. The city outside the window said nothing. The tea had cooled. The palette sat on the counter. Zara looked at him, at the dragon tattoo and the open collar and the hands that had put the mug down and were now resting flat on the table. Fully visible, the posture of someone who has put down the thing they were holding as a form of statement, she reached across the table and covered his hand with hers. He looked down at it, then up at her. Neither of them spoke. There was nothing, in that moment, that speech could add. The Meridian campaign launched 6 weeks later across all 4 markets simultaneously. The billboards went up in Seoul, London, Snow, Paulo, and Lagos within the same 48 hours. In each city, the image that anchored the campaign was the same: Zara in the white linen dress. The natural crown of her hair against a background of warm light. Her face in 3/4 turned with the expression that the photographer had captured on the 3rd day of shooting. Not a model's expression, not a pose, but the face of a person who has decided exactly who she is and is no longer asking for confirmation. The response was, by any metric the brand used to measure such things, extraordinary. The campaign trended in 3 of the 4 markets within the first week. A publication in Lagos described the imagery as a reclamation. A fashion critic in London wrote that it was the first luxury campaign in recent memory that does not ask its subject to be anything other than entirely herself. The brand's global creative director sent Zara a handwritten note that she kept. She did not send it to her mother with no caption. She called her and read it aloud. And her mother listened all the way to the end, and then said nothing for a moment, and then said, "I always knew." And this time it did not feel like a beginning. It felt like an arrival. Celine Moreau did not return to the industry in any significant capacity. The accumulated accounts from the 7 women who had spoken publicly over that weekend were not the kind of thing that a reputation can navigate back from, not because of their volume, but because of their specificity. The details that could only exist in the testimony of people who had been there. The texture of truth that is not achievable through fabrication. Several agencies that had previously worked with her quietly removed her from their preferred contractors lists. She did not mount a second public response. There was nothing in the architecture of a second response that could hold against what had already been said. She had swept the 3rd-floor corridor on her last day, as instructed, whether she had understood, while doing it, that the instruction had not been an act of cruelty, but a precise and deliberate mirror, a single opportunity to feel. In the body, the specific quality of being assigned to a task that does not match your sense of your own worth. Held inside a building that had once been organized around that sense, she had not said. She had not been asked. The question was perhaps too architectural to answer in any satisfying way, and the answer, if it existed, was hers alone to carry. The workshop launched 3 months after the campaign. It was called Full Spectrum, the name chosen by Zara in collaboration with the new creative direction team, and it stated, Purpose was the professional development of makeup artists specializing in the complete range of human skin tones, with particular emphasis on the techniques, formulations, and aesthetic frameworks that had been systematically underdeveloped in industry training programs for decades. The first session was held in the main studio of the agency on a Tuesday morning, which none of the 40 participants knew was the same day of the week as the morning that had precipitated everything. Zara presented the opening. She spoke about craft, and she spoke about specificity. And she spoke about the difference between a professional who has learned a skill and one who has learned to see. And the room was full of people in their 20s, with kits and notebooks, and the specific attentiveness of those who are at the beginning of something they know will matter. At the back of the room, in the last row of chairs, Hookchin sat with a paper coffee cup and a posture she had come to know well. The slight lean back, the arms loosely crossed, the expression of someone who is present and watching and has made no decision about how long he will stay because he does not need to, because staying is not a calculation he is currently making. She was at the front of the room, he was at the back. There were 40 people and a considerable distance between them. She was mid-sentence when she looked up and found him. She did not break her sentence. She held his gaze for exactly 3 seconds, the duration of an acknowledgement. The duration of a shared private fluency, the duration of everything that had accumulated between two people, who had moved from strangers to something with no clean professional category, and who had decided, in the quiet way that certain decisions are made between certain people, that the absence of a clean category was not a problem requiring resolution, but simply a condition of the specific and particular thing. They had become to each other 3 seconds. Then she returned to the room, to the 40 faces, to the craft, to the work. That was the whole point and had always been the whole point, and continued her sentence from exactly where she had left it. He stayed for the full session. Afterward, when the participants had filed out in the animated clusters of people, energized by the beginning of something, he waited by the door while she spoke with 3 young artists who had questions, and he was patient with the patience that was no longer the patience of the professionally composed, but the more specific patience of someone who is waiting for a particular person and does not mind the waiting. When the last participant left, she crossed the room and stood in front of him, and he handed her the paper cup, her coffee, which he had gotten for her from the cafe downstairs, which she had not asked for, but which was the correct order, which he knew because he had been paying attention, which was by now the most fundamental fact she knew about him, that he paid attention, that he had always paid attention, that attention was the first language he had ever used with her before either of them had the words for what it meant. She took the cup. "How was it?" he asked. "Good," she said. "Really good." He nodded. She could see, in the way she could now read him, in the millimeter adjustments of expression, in the quality of stillness, that he was pleased. Not performing pleasure, simply experiencing it, and allowing her to see that he was experiencing it, which remained, even after months, a choice she understood the weight of. They walked out of the building together into the afternoon, the city receiving them with its indifference, which was by now a familiar indifference, almost comfortable. The indifference of a backdrop that has been present for the whole story and carries no judgment about any of it. The sun was doing something with the light between the buildings. The specific angular gold of a late afternoon in that city, and it caught the dragon on his neck and the gold hoops at her ears, and the ordinary extraordinary fact of 2 people walking beside each other who had come to this point from the wreckage of a Tuesday morning that had been designed by someone's smallness to diminish one of them. It had not worked. It had, in the specific and ironic arithmetic of consequences, produced the opposite of what it intended, had taken the thing it tried to reduce and made it larger, had taken the thing it tried to isolate and given it allies, had taken a moment of ugliness and set in motion a chain of events that ended with a workshop full of young artists learning to see correctly, and a campaign seen by millions in 4 cities, and a woman walking into her own afternoon with the full, undiminished weight of everything she had always been. Not all revenge has a scream. Some have only a signature, a palette of pigments imported from Nigeria, and a man at the back of a room who never stopped paying attention. And sometimes that's enough. Sometimes that's all. The third-floor corridor of what had once been Aura Agency was clean. It had been clean for months. No one thought about it anymore. If this story moved you, stop for a moment and reflect. Have you ever walked into a room fully prepared, fully yourself, and had someone look straight through you, or worse, decide you weren't worth their time simply because of what you look like? And if someone unexpected ever stood up for you in a moment when everyone else looked away, did you ever find out why they did it? Because sometimes the people who change our lives aren't the loudest in the room. Sometimes they're the ones standing quietly in the back, paying attention when no one else would.